everyone. So happy to be here with all of you. My name is Mollie Duffy. My pronouns are she, her. I am the head of learning and development at Lattice. And I am so excited to talk about this topic. In my role, I interact with a lot of managers in our manager development program, as well as our wonderful people team and our HR leaders. And both of these populations, our managers and our HR leaders, play a big role in employee performance and engagement. And in most of the organizations where I've worked, managers really rely on and have a good relationship with their HR managers, and vice versa. So today we're going to talk about how to make the partnership between these two groups even stronger. And I want to welcome Melanie Naranjo, Alexis MacDonald, and Kameko Leung. Okay, welcome everyone. So I'm going to have you all introduce yourself, and if you can share your name, your company, your role, how big your company is, because that's always interesting, whether you're remote or hybrid, and then also what your first job was. So we'll start with you.
Okay, so I have to remember all that. All right.
Yes.
Name, Alexis MacDonald. I work for a company called Clue. I'm the VP of People. We are about 220 employees globally. We're actually based in Canada. And first job, was that it?
Oh, and hybrid or?
Hybrid. 2 days a week in office in our hubs. And in terms of first job, I was a barista at a coffee shop.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Kameko Leung, pronounced she, her. I currently work for Pinterest. I manage our leadership development programming in learning and development. But I also heard that a bunch of my former coworkers at Zillow were on the call virtually, so hi. Good to see you all. Pinterest, we embrace something called PinFlex, which is really about flexibility and being able to work where you're going to be the most successful. So largely remote, however, we do have offices that people come into. About 5,500 people right now.
First job?
First job, oh goodness. My first job, I was a waitress, or not a waitress, a hostess at a Chinese restaurant called Gary Chu's up in Santa Rosa.
Thank you.
Hi all, apologies in advance. I already know I'm gonna forget one of these
That's
things.
Okay.
Pronoun she, her, Melanie Naranjo. I head up the people team at Athena. We're a compliance training company, everything from harassment prevention, cybersecurity. Let's see, size, we're closing in on 70 people. We are completely remote. And my first job, I honestly cannot remember, but it was probably something to do with babysitting, tutoring, cat sitting, something in that realm of things.
Cat sitting. Excellent. And at Lattice, we have 550 employees. Some people are remote, some people are hybrid. So we've got a big range here of employee size, which will be interesting to refer back to. So often we think about what managers can learn from HR leaders, but in a true partnership, each side is learning from each other. So we want to talk a little bit about what HR leaders can learn from managers. And I want to start with you, Melanie, and ask, how have you seen managers helping HR leaders bring the focus back to the human relationship?
Oh yeah, so I can give you a very specific example. This happened just a couple of weeks ago, and it's a really common one. So we had a manager who was talking to an employee, and over the course of that conversation, the employee sort of, let slip very casually that they were neurodivergent. But it was in the middle of a constructive feedback conversation, right? So now we got performance overlapping with, something that could come in the realm of reasonable accommodation. And so, first of all, can I just get a show of hands? Who here has sort of like overlap between performance and reasonable accommodation request? Yeah, okay, it's a real common thing. We all know this. Yeah, I'm not alone. And so me, classic HR, said, whoa, breaks everybody. This person just used a word, and now I need to step in and offer reasonable accommodation. I don't care if they ask for it. I got to offer it because we got to protect ourselves. And the manager, understandably, was like, girl, back it up, please, slow down. I want you to think about what it would feel like for that employee, for her to have opened up to me and just shared that, And now the next thing she knows, HR is all up in her business, having a very formal conversation, and she didn't even intend for this to become a bigger thing. And I said, oh, thank you for grounding me back in reality. And so together we worked on a compromise for how to then have that conversation more effectively, how I could empower the manager to own that conversation and follow up. We're still doing the things that we have to do, but it doesn't have to feel like this very scary HR thing. And here's the thing, it's a little bit ironic for me to give this example because we're human resources, right? Like we're supposed to be the most human sort of part of this equation. But the reality is when we are in this day in and day out, we can get a little bit in the sort of in the wheel of like, okay, process, orient, this, that, protect ourselves. And we can forget what it feels like to have that conversation live and the actual impact it's gonna have and how, it could backfire. And so the answer to your question is, I think that it needs to be a true partnership as opposed to I'm HR and forcing these policies on you. As instead it should be, hey, here are some things that we need to be legally thinking about. Let's partner on the best way, the most effective way to cover our bases, have the communication, and still maintain that relationship.
Such a great example. And as you said, you would think we would be in that mindset sometimes as HR leaders, but it's like, wait, hold on. Alexis, any examples you want to share from Clue?
I mean, I think the whole idea of learning from our managers is so important. We're business partners, right? Like they are not human resources partners. We are business partners, so we need to understand their business primarily, first and foremost. And I always think it's really important to think about what level of manager are you talking to and what is their zone of expertise. So if you're talking to an executive, what is their perspective on our strategic plans? What are the gaps they see in our strategic plans? What should we be thinking about for next year? Do they have perhaps this is someone who might have a sense of what a potential acquisition target might look like. So you can learn from a senior executive about the future state of the business in a really compelling way if you approach it that way. And then if you go right down to, I was speaking to someone who was just promoted to be a manager from a team lead role, and they were in this team lead role, they're very much player coach, like total IC, and they were in this CS organization. And so with that person, I was asking questions and learning all about our customers and our users. So, you can think strategy, customer, you really get to learn from them through the lens of who they are and how they interact with the business.
Such a good example. Yeah, Lattice, I learned so much from the people who are directly interacting with our customers. I sometimes do that, but people who are doing that all day, every day.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that you all have tried or learned recently in terms of supporting managers that are different than the traditional HR best practices? Kameko, I want to start with you.
So first of all, I recently was involved in a literature review, just looking at what the data is saying around managers and the state of managers today. And something that was just fascinating that came out of this was that 54% of managers are saying that they are experiencing workplace stress and fatigue. And this is not surprising when they're being expected to cover 51% more responsibilities than they're actually capable of doing. That's just wild when we think about that. And then we're also saying, well, we need to upskill them and develop their capabilities. And so from learning and development, that means, okay, we've got to help them create space and time to really focus on themselves and their own development. So when we were looking at this and saying, okay, well, how do we do this for our leaders? How do we help them create that space for themselves? The traditional approach would be to say, okay, great, let's take them to a 1 week offsite. Let's have everyone fly in. Well, Pinterest is a global company. I work with a lot of tech companies that are a variety of different situations like that. And the cost for that just becomes skyrocketing. So you have to also think about meeting managers where they are and how we can actually create learning experiences that are cohesive and work for the way that they're working right now. So as Alexis was saying, you have to think about the level of the leader as well. And so for a frontline manager, first-time manager, where so much is about them building confidence in their own competence and skill sets, they actually do probably need a longer period of time to network and build relationships. So that might mean 3-4 days that they're sitting together, really learning from each other and collaborating and really realizing I have this whole new network of peers that I can rely on, not just HR. Versus our executive leaders, our senior leaders, they have tons of information coming at them from every direction, up, down, and across. they don't have the ability to sit in a virtual setting, for example, and be able to focus and really spend that time developing. Taking them and putting them on site actually is often a better way to support them. And that's what we were hearing in our focus group from leaders, is that when you're at that senior level, you need the ability to shut off the noise around you so that you can really focus on your development, versus when you're at a more junior management level, you can do a lot of those things in a virtual environment. It just has to be well designed.
And this is something that Kameko is great at, and will be a theme that we touch on, and I want to hear a little bit more from you about this, Melanie, but thinking about what do our managers need when it comes to development, and that's going to be different at different levels, where we might be in person, we might be virtual. You had an example recently of one where you were like tight on time.
Yes, so, okay, show of hands, who here has a manager who says, I really care about managing, but I just don't have the time? Like, I want manager training, but like, oh, yeah, okay. It's a real common thing. And I think, understandably, HR's response tends to be, well, if you cared enough, you would make the time. Right? Yeah? Okay. I make the time. Here's the reality. If that is your response, what's going to happen is you're going to butt heads and you're not going to get anywhere. And so instead, I really recommend that we start actually listening to our managers and take them at face value and say, okay, you don't have time. Here's what we're going to do to save you time. So I'll give a couple of very specific examples. I'll keep them brief. One is we rolled out manager training because our managers wanted it, but they said, but I don't have any time. So what we did is we do this thing, it's called replace, don't add. So if every manager training was going to be 1 hour, we replaced an existing company-wide town hall with a manager training. So we canceled that town hall, freed up an hour for everyone else, and then we just used that time for manager training, right? So now, what excuse do we have? There's no excuse, right? I didn't add more time. I just gave you time, right? Another example was, managers really struggling. So actually, I'm curious to hear this. Anybody ever have a manager, you're having lots of conversations with their direct report, then you get to termination discussion, the employee is like taken by complete surprise. Like, what? My job was at risk. I had no idea. Okay, so that was another thing that really came down to time. Like, how do I effectively have these conversations in a good amount of time and keep them short? We could have doubled down and said, well, managers, you're going to have to read this 9-page handbook on how to give effective feedback, and we're going to do X, Y, and Z, right? Laughter, because you're correct, it would not have worked. And so instead what we did was we just started color coding our feedback. Yellow means this is a nice to have, no big deal, it's just a stretch opportunity. Orange means if you don't do this, you're not going to lose your job, but you're not going to be able to get a pay increase or get promoted because you have reached your limit here. And red means danger, danger. Your job is at risk. And so I didn't need to spend 3 training sessions educating managers on how to more effectively give feedback. I just gave them common language that the entire company knows. And it's so common language at our company now that when, understandably, managers start to get wishy-washy, which, by the way, let's acknowledge, that's always going to happen. Who here can say that they have themselves never struggled to give feedback effectively, never maybe watered down the message a little? We all have. And so rather than trying to make our managers perfect, why don't we empower them with the tools that are going to catch them when they start to sort of struggle? And so now when our managers get a little wishy-washy, our direct reports will actually say, hey, you're making me a little nervous here. Is this an orange or a red? And then the manager can very easily say, no, it's an orange. Sorry, I didn't mean to confuse you. Or, I'm sorry, it's a red. And so you need to really be paying attention here. And so again, all of these things come back to listening to your manager truly, understanding the underlying issue, and instead of fighting them and trying to make them accommodate you finding ways to accommodate them, which, by the way, will build trust. Because the next time you roll out a training or a tool sheet, they're going to pay attention because they know that you're going to do it in a way that accounts for the challenges, the very real, meaningful challenges that they are facing on a day-to-day basis.
I love the specific example, and I was like, I need to steal this. Like, send us your sheet, your color-coded sheet. So what's great about that is that you took a constraint, which is we don't have a lot of time, and you not only created a development program within the time that you had, but also what came out of that was a performance management tool that came out of that, like designing within constraints, which I think is really a nice like added benefit as well. And so many of the managers I talk to are concerned about how exactly to explain the criticality of a performance issue, and they get tripped up on like, I don't know what the right word is to use. And so this just takes that out of the equation. And it's like, you don't have to have exactly the right word. You don't have to have a script. We're just going to use the color-coded language. I want to go back to an example that you shared, kind of in the same vein of new policies or tools coming out of a manager's needs. Would you share about how you dealt with like the internal posting? Yeah,
we were having a conversation, we've touched on it a little bit here. We were having a conversation about the old trope of the HR person who has like all of the answers and all of the right policies to follow. And if you just do it our way, you're fine. I was giving an example of something that happened recently where we were talking about a potential promotion for an employee. This person was the clear winner for the job. They were, a very high performer in the team. It's a relatively small team. Everybody would have been thrilled. And the traditional response that initially came out of our team was like, okay, we should probably think about posting it generally so that everybody has an opportunity to apply and it gives them interview experience and all that stuff. And through a conversation with the leader, we came to, look, no, we're going to agree now, moving forward, that we're only ever going to post a job internally if it's genuinely an opportunity. If there's someone who's the clear winner for the job, we're not going to implement a rule that doesn't make sense for anyone and makes people feel misled. So we said that publicly. When we announced this person's promotion, we said exactly what I just said around, if you see a job posting internally, you can trust that it's genuine. And if you don't, you can trust that we've done the steps to evaluate the person's readiness for the promotion effectively.
It's like, yeah, of course, this is the better way, but I think only in conversation with the leader did this come out, and I really applaud the transparency around that as well. So let's talk a little bit about how we can build more empathy between managers and HR leaders so that they can better understand their roles. So we will start with you, Melanie.
Sure, yeah. So in terms of how to build better empathy with managers.
Understanding.
So I think one of the things to really understand is we're all people at the end of the day. And I think it's hard to lose sight of that, right? It's easy to assume, okay, a manager didn't do their job of giving constructive feedback, therefore they don't care, they're not prioritizing it. And on the other side, right, it's easy to assume that, HR doesn't care about people. HR is just here for the business. They're just trying to cut costs. They just want to save the company. And we're seeing it a lot increasingly as the market is today, right? It is an employer market, which it was not in 2021, which it has led to a lot of whiplash for employees, understandably. I think it's really important to be having really transparent conversations around the why behind things you are doing and opening yourself up to feedback and open conversations, and in turn soliciting conversations. And so, I hosted a webinar recently, and the title was how to say no to employee drama. And people were very excited about this topic, and they thought that the topic was going to be all about just hating on employees. And there was a little bit of venting, I'm not gonna lie. Okay, but then we reeled it back in, and really what it came down to was how do we make sure that understanding from the employee's perspective, there's a reason why they're skeptical, right? They don't have access to all the internal conversations we have. By the time an employee gets terminated, they don't know how hard we have advocated for them. They don't know how hard we advocated to get them the best separation package possible. They don't know how much back and forth we had with that manager before we made the decision that, okay, you have now given enough feedback and enough opportunity to make this decision. They don't know. And so something that I'm going to acknowledge is a little bit controversial because I think it can be difficult to implement. You've got to do it in baby steps. Is this idea of, which is, I didn't coin this term, radical candor, right? And opening these conversations to employees, hey, let me explain to you how we think about terminations at this company and the conversations that we have internally. If you have any questions or ideas about how we could do this better, please share. A very specific example that we have at Athena is we have publicly posted to our employees our compensation philosophy and FAQ. And it literally says, here's how we determine where everyone falls on the salary band. These are the questions that we ask ourselves. This is what it means to be bottom, middle, top. If you have any questions, please talk to your manager. And really critical to this is empowering your manager to be able to have these conversations. Because I don't know about you all, but I don't have time for every single employee to be asking me to explain why they are comped what they are comped. Go talk to your manager, please. But that can only happen if you empower the manager. And so to your question of how do we build empathy, I think it's about asking more questions of our managers. Hey, what are the hardest things on your plate right now? 1 to 5, how hard is it being a manager? And then starting that conversation. But 2, let me explain to you all of the things that I do from an HR perspective, not in a defensive way, not to tell you that I'm absolutely right and I've looked around every corner, but to say, this is what we're doing. If you have ideas, please contribute. Let's partner together on the path forward.
Yeah, that transparency is so key. Yeah. Alexis, what else can we do to build empathy?
I think one thing we do at Clue that I can take zero credit for because it was in place when I joined, and I joined for context just in June, so just a few months ago. So I'm having many of these conversations where I'm getting to know managers and getting to know the business. But one of the things that Clue has done for years is the way they structure their business partnering meetings is in a pod. So what we do is we take our business partner and our talent partner and the business leader, and they meet as a group. And any other people that are relevant to that discussion. Sometimes it might be an additional talent partner or someone else. I tend to go to as many of the meetings as I can. And you meet in a pod. So now imagine you're a manager and you've got kind of your full stack team in front of you. So now as you are talking about the challenges that you have in front of you, which as a manager will be anywhere from, I have these 6 roles to fill. I think this person's gonna leave. That one just gave their notice. This one needs a promotion. And we've got kickoff next week and I haven't done my slides yet. So the manager can then say all of that and we as the team can hear it and can understand how to support. And what it really does, I think the most magical thing is it really helps that talent partner, the recruitment partner, because so often they're left out of the equation until the very end and now there's a vacancy and they have to just go. So they have an insight of all of the challenges that's on someone's plate and they can get going on recruitment as soon as possible. So that's one way that we try to collectively build empathy with the manager.
And Alexis and I chatted about this, and the way that they do it at Clue is so it's the HRBP and then it's the recruiting partner. But you could have other members of the HR people team, like we were saying, you could have the HRBP and the person who's running performance management or L&D. And it doesn't have to be every time. It could be once a month or something like that. But having that team come together, because so often HRBPs get stuck being that hub, and they're like, okay, I have to get the information from the managers and I have to pass it along to all of the other centers of excellence within the people team.
Totally.
And then the other centers of excellence are like, I don't have the context, I'm building a program, but I don't know what's on manager's plate. So I just love that so much. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, so now let's talk about how HR leaders can help managers. And I want to go beyond kind of the usual, we've talked a lot about manager training. I love manager training, but that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind to think about how else we can provide meaningful support. And so I'd love to go to you, Kameko.
So one of the things I want to just acknowledge, first of all, I love the frameworks that have been shared so far, but also being empathetic with leaders also means understanding that they could have all of the knowledge and frameworks, but if they don't have an opportunity to practice, then it's never going to happen. They're never going to build that confidence to be able to go and be empowered to go have that conversation and say okay, I know what I need to say. So that's something that we think a lot about in terms of making sure that there's a strong partnership between L&D and HR so that we can say, okay, well now how do we get them to this state where they are confident and capable to be delivering on what we're asking of them? But there's also these additional complexities when you're working in a remote or a hybrid environment. And the first thing I just want to acknowledge is when we moved to remote, when we had to mass move to remote during the pandemic, there was this feeling of, oh my gosh, this has never been done before. What are we going to do? We have to go figure it all out and reinvent the wheel. And that's not true. In fact, I bet if I were to ask the room right now, how many of you have had a manager that was not co-located with you? Whoa, almost all of us put our hands up. So working in distributed teams, working remotely, working in hybrid, it's not a new thing, but it is new that we're doing this on such a massive scale, and also where companies, large companies, are saying, okay, we're gonna figure out how to make this work. One of the biggest challenges, though, that managers face in that environment is this feeling of loneliness. They really struggle to figure out, well, how do I connect now? How do I learn from other leaders and figure out what the right behaviors and expectations are for me in this role are? And what's funny is that when we were in person, it didn't just magically happen. We didn't click a button and magically have a relationship with somebody and magically understand how to be a great leader. It took time and it took intention, and the same thing is key in a remote environment. But now we have to teach managers how to have a different type of mindset around how they're building relationships, and part of that comes from how we're setting up environments where they can connect. So if they're new to management, that might mean we need a 6-month program where they're going to be meeting on a regular basis, building those relationships and trying things out with their peers. If they're more senior, like I said before, it might mean that they need to come in person so they can shut out the noise and really focus on building those relationships. But that sense of loneliness is a really pervasive challenge that leaders are facing right now. And what we can do is teach new ways, or not even new ways, but reinforce maybe some of those old relationship building techniques and create the environments where they can connect.
And can you share specifically how you're doing that, how you're encouraging managers at Pinterest to build those relationships virtually?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it first of all comes down to really good learning and development design. I think there's a lot of places where you think virtual training, same thing as in person, right? You just put it on the screen, and it's very much not. You have to really have a strong design in the programming that you're building, where you don't just throw them into a breakout room and say, good luck to you. Have a conversation about this question, this random question. It starts with, I was recently reading Super Communicators. Anyone reading that book right now? It's a really good one. One of the ways that I'm kind of implementing some of those strategies are in a program that I'm currently working on, starting off with questions that help to first just build the immediate connection between leaders, and then starting to layer in connections throughout additional breakout groups that help uncover their beliefs, their values, and how they're feeling about situations and their experiences. So it starts to deepen that connection through the time that they're in a program. On top of that, they'll do other things like problem-solving activities in breakout groups, and they'll do other things that have them follow up and continue to have those ongoing connections with each other. So we have to think long-term about it. We have to think very strategically about how do we help create this environment that may not feel natural and make it feel more organic.
One of the things that we hear a lot from managers is that it can be harder to notice when people on your team are struggling when you're not in person. Can you talk a little bit about how you have helped managers do that?
Yeah, so we're an all-remote company. So certainly, something I noticed, I'll give a specific example that sort of like really made this just like obviously apparent to me was there was an employee and the manager ended up having to give them tough feedback that day. And the employee just sort of like broke down in tears. And it turned out this employee had been going through this really difficult time and the manager had no idea. And I am convinced that, if we were in person, this is a thing you would have noticed over time, right? You would have seen the person's demeanor. You would have seen when they come into the office. You would have seen them, outside of the meeting and how they're sitting and how they're presenting themselves. But what happens in an all-remote environment? You only see what you see on the Zoom, right? And if you happen to be looking at their square and then they turn off Zoom and you don't see the rest of their demeanor, their body language, all of that, how they come to work, what time they leave, all that sort of thing. And so, that's a thing that's very easy to miss. And it just like convinced me, oh my goodness, we need to figure this out. Now, as I said before, it doesn't work. to tell managers, just care more and be more thoughtful and ask the questions, because quite frankly, they do care, but they're just busy. And especially if you have player coaches, they have a ton on their mind. They have their own issues that they need to work on. And so rather than continuing to try and force managers to do this or do more management trainings to force it on them, I actually, what we did was, I put together a list of questions and I was like, what are the kinds of EQ questions I'd love for managers to be asking? Questions like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how motivated are you when you come to work every day? And what would it take to get you half a point higher, right? What is the biggest stress on your plate right now? How can I, as a manager, help you at work today or this week, or make your workload more manageable, whatever. Put together a list. And what I did was, we have a manager Slack channel, and I just did this. At the beginning of the quarter, I schedule one question to go out every Monday morning. And every Monday morning it's, hey, here's a question. In your one-on-one, you may want to consider asking this to kick off your next check-in with your direct report. Here's the key. The key is, one, it's not mandatory, right? We don't want to be prescriptive about this. The question might not make sense for them at that time. The question might not be helpful to them, right? Two, I am not forcing them to remember what to do. I am bringing it literally, I'm bringing it right to them. And the idea is, hopefully, I will touch on a question at some point that happens to be really important, like, wow, I didn't think about that. And they will ask in their next one-on-one. It won't feel forced and prescriptive, right? And we have just found that it's been monumentally helpful. Managers will reach out and say, hey, I asked that question. Oh my gosh, it opened up this thing, it surfaced this underlying issue I was completely unaware of. And guess how much time it took the manager to do that? Literally the time that it took to ask the question, right? They didn't have to carve out all this time to be really thoughtful, this and that. They just saw the alert on the Slack channel, asked the question. And so again, it's all about how can you find ways to meet your managers halfway, to incentivize them to do these things that they genuinely want to do. They just don't have the bandwidth to be more intentional about it on their own.
Love it. Another thing that we've seen, so if those of you out there who use Lattice, you can create one-on-one templates in Lattice. So you could create a template that's like a first one-on-one for a manager and a report to ask like a lot of EQ questions. Like that's a really good time to go deep. You know, what's your career vision, all of that. But you can also have ones come up periodically. And a lot of our managers internally at Lattice also use weekly updates in Lattice for this. Sometimes people feel more comfortable like typing an answer of like, yeah, I am having a hard time, than saying it verbally. And so oftentimes our managers will see something come up in a weekly update and then add it to their next one-on-one to be like, let's follow up on that. Like I want to check in, which is interesting. So we've been talking a little bit about this, but I want to dive more into what tactics you all use to help your HR leaders coach managers. And we'll start with you, Alexis.
Sure. I just want to say on your updates, on the Lattice updates, as a former Lattice customer, at my last company, I was one of the first 500 Lattice customers, so, you know. But we used the updates, and I always recommended to managers that the last question would be, is there anything else you'd like to add? So it's like so open-ended, and so sometimes someone would say, my sister's wedding is next week, or my anxiety is really bad this month. Mm-hmm. Like it just, and then as soon as the feature came out where you could just like pop it onto your one-on-one, that was great. But it was a good way, and as an employee, it was a good way for me to tell the CEO whether I had a tactical thing or whether I had like something big happening in my life. So it was a really good tool just to plug that feature for a second. Your question, I think, was tactics around supporting.
On coaching managers. So like, a lot of times we do role play.
Yes,
you know.
yeah, for sure. I was gonna say I'm such a big believer in role playing and modeling and mirroring, being a mirror for managers, and it's so cheesy because you know, if you're a manager in a meeting with me and I say let's role play for a second, you're gonna be like, oh my god, and then I always just say no, I'm you. I'll just do you, and then I'll make a little joke about you for a second and kind of trying to cut the tension, and then I will say. Generally, we're having a conversation about like two options. Should we talk about the restructure this way? Should we talk about the restructure that way? And then I will do the talk track from that person's point of view. and just speak as if I was them. So I'd say something like, hey team, we're noticing that our mid-market segment has like the highest level of new business, but the renewal time is the longest of all of our segments. So we know that we need more bandwidth in that mid-market segment, and we need the expertise from our strong folks in our enterprise team to come fill those gaps. So I'm actually going to be announcing and like working with some of you to move some of you from this team over to this team, and it's so that we can meet our business needs. And so you replay that back to them because you've been listening to them as a business partner. And then they're like, oh, now I know how I can potentially say this without walking into a room with my team and saying, Sally and Joe, you're moving to another team. That might not be as exciting for you. Like, it's all about that role play moment, and I found that to be helpful.
Yes, and I like what you said, like, let's not call it a role play, it's just practice.
Yeah.
Kameko, slightly on this topic, but just something I've been thinking a lot about. Can you talk about what trends you've seen with Gen Z?
Yes, Gen Z has been observing management now, and they're starting to get into the workforce at this point and starting to look at what are their career potentials and career possibilities. And has anyone heard of this term, unbossing? This has come up recently. It's mostly a Gen Z term, but a lot of millennials are feeling this as well. They're looking at how managers' roles are and the expectations that managers have around their roles, and they're saying, wow, the emotional burden that they have to carry, the messaging that they have to deliver on top of driving results, on top of holding everyone accountable. No, thank you. I would rather be an individual contributor. So that's what unbossing is about, and it's this active choice to say, my career path, if I have two options where I could grow as an individual contributor or move into management, I would rather grow as an individual contributor. And that becomes a really big problem down the line when you start to look at succession planning, when you start to look at, Alexis had mentioned earlier back there, diversity in the workforce and the diversity in your leadership teams. So I think we do need to think about how are we making leadership exciting and something that is of interest to the next generation. And maybe that is around, we have to talk about role design. Maybe we have to talk about how we're rewarding and supporting our managers. And maybe we also need to make it a little bit more fun too, about the different ways in which they can engage their employees and really be those culture carriers, because that's what they are. At the end of the day, you could have all the best benefits in the world, all of the best pay in the world, but what your employees are saying at the dinner table is they're saying, how did my manager treat me today? What was my relationship with my peers? Is the culture that I'm being told at this company, is that what I'm experiencing? So if we're expecting that of our leaders, how do we make it fun for them and help them check in with their teams in meaningful ways? Like, I recently, anyone familiar with Mudang? The hippo? We don't have to make checking in on people such a serious thing, like how are you all feeling? I had a picture of a bunch of Mudang pictures, and I said on a scale of 1 to 10 Mudangs, which Mudang are you feeling today? And if they're all saying, I'm feeling the screaming Mudang, that tells me something as a leader, that maybe we need to have a conversation about morale, about maybe workload, something like that.
And for those of you who weren't in the know about this, it's a baby hippo who's all over social media. Yeah. Okay, I have one last question for all of you, and I want to pose this. It's a very honest question. What is the one thing that we're afraid to change when it comes to supporting managers that could make all of the difference? So this is about like challenging the status quo. So we'll start with you, Melanie. We'll go down the line.
Yeah, I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, so apologies for any redundancy here. But I think the best thing that we can do is to really empower our managers to do the things we want them to do. And it sounds really obvious, but let me say why that's a little bit harder in practice. We are so used to controlling the situation and wanting to control the situation, right? I don't want my manager to say the wrong thing, put their foot in their mouth, and now we're in a legal issue. And I say this as a compliance training company, right? We care a lot about compliance, right? But wouldn't it be so much better if our managers could have these conversations with their direct reports versus us having to navigate these conversations every single time for our managers? Wouldn't it just free up so much of our time, actually provide a growth opportunity for the manager, and then further build and strengthen that relationship with the manager and direct report? And so, for me, it would be things like, how do you just go to educate your managers on what comp philosophy is, how we make these decisions, and then they can have those conversations. How do you educate managers on talking to their employees about how it is that we're going to make a termination discussion? How do you educate them on how to respond when someone tells them that, you know, they're going to go on parental leave, or they have a medical issue, or they need to request a reasonable accommodation? Now, am I saying they should do the reasonable accommodation process? Absolutely not. But how do we give them a script that says, hey, I care so much about what you just shared with me. Thank you so much for being vulnerable with me. The reality is I'm not super educated on this, and I want to make sure that I connect you with the right person. So I'm going to pull in HR. But before we do that, let's chat. You know, how can I partner with you as a manager? What support do you need from me here? Versus, oh, shut down the conversation. Go to HR right now. Right? It's gonna tarnish that relationship, right? Or they might just put their foot in their mouth, and now you got to do damage control. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be working in damage control mode 24/7. So how do we empower managers to do more and distribute the workload of people?
Thank you.
I would say from a learning and development perspective, really partnering with managers. Often what we do is we say, here's the problem, we've diagnosed the problem, here's how we're going to design a solution or an intervention to help get employees or managers from point A to point B, instead of saying, hey manager, can I partner with you in uncovering what you need? So recently I was working with a leader on a 2-hour session for their team. I put together the base for this session because it's an area of expertise of mine, but then I worked with that manager and said, how do we customize it for your organization? They're engineering. I'm not an engineer. I certainly shouldn't be trying to give them engineering examples, but that leader can. And often I think we get really worried that a leader is going to maybe say something that's not quite on message or quite on brand for what we want. But that's not a terrible thing. They understand their audience sometimes a lot better than we do. So truly partnering with them to customize the solution that's right for them, and then also trusting them to understand the core of the message that we're trying to get to and putting it in a way that's going to be receptive for their team.
Thank you.
I mean, I think the theme of what we're all talking about is around control and trust. Like, I think as HR folks, we tend to like having a little bit of control around things. I know I can speak for myself, and 100% of every HR person I've ever met. I think it's really about, you know, we've been demanding to be in the room, as we should be, and we're really trying to be there and understand. But what are we all here for? Like, at the end of the day, we want to build workplaces where all sorts of managers, even when we're not in the room, are having people-first conversations. So sometimes you're not going to be in the room when they start, you know, coming up with a great people initiative or employee initiative, and you got to be kind of okay with that. Like, how can you make sure that you can operate with a little more trust and relinquish a little bit of control, knowing that we're all here to build these like people-centric organizations?
Thank you. All right, well, let's give a big round of applause. Thank you, Melanie, Kameko, Alexis. Thank you all for being here.